Hello everybody. Thank you for turning into this digital lecture sponsored by the Society for American Music. In this video, I will discuss Steve Reich's 1966 composition Come Out, a piece he composed in commemoration of the Harlem Six, a group of black youths wrongly tried for the 1964 murder of a Jewish Hungarian shop owner. In order to discuss the piece, I will organize my lecture into three distinct sections. The first section will refer to the piece's historical context. Specifically, I will address what is happening in America during the mid-1960s when this piece was written. The second section explores why and how Steve Reich composed Come Out. The final section simply asks, so what? Why do we care about the context, and why do we care about this composition? Although I will discuss the relevance of the piece in greater detail later, I would like to briefly answer that question now in order to provide you with the thesis of my lecture today. I believe that Come Out provides us with a musical narrative that can inform us about United States domestic history. More specifically, the piece evokes the shift in tactics of the civil rights movement towards black nationalism during the mid-1960s and the subsequent paranoia that such a shift instilled in the American public. I find it fascinating that by musically analyzing Come Out, we not only understand a piece of music, but also better understand a particular moment of time. For those who are maybe not particularly well versed in this period of history, I hope that's what you all come away with at the end of this lecture. Before we listen to Come Out, I would like to provide some broad historical context that will help us analyze the piece later. After the passage of the monumental 1964 Civil Rights Act, activists turned their attention to northern cities, where many black Americans still experienced discrimination and segregation. Unfortunately, the legislative achievements of the Civil Rights Act did not improve the conditions of the black population in cities and neighborhoods like Harlem, New York, where tensions rose as blacks grew increasingly frustrated with what they saw to be the irrelevant steps towards legalized integration between black and white. As a response, black nationalists, such as the prominent Harlem-based Nation of Islam preacher Malcolm X, promoted a different agenda: racial separation instead of integration, and armed self-defense instead of nonviolent protest. However, black nationalists did not just live in Harlem. For instance, in 1966, when Reich composed Come Out, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland, California, and Stokely Carmichael, who popularized the phrase Black Power, was elected chairman of the Southern-based Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. Nothing epitomized the shift in the civil rights movement's tactics better than the changing membership of SNCC. In the early 1960s, whites, and notably Jews, comprised a substantial portion of SNCC's membership. Yet by the mid-1960s, many white members left the organization. This internal shift became very real in 1967 once SNCC threw their support behind the Arab countries instead of Israel during the Six-Day War. It was in this atmosphere of growing black nationalism and perceived anti-Semitism that Steve Reich composed Come Out. The voice of the boy you hear in Come Out is 18-year-old Daniel Hamm describing the process of being detained and brutally beaten after a brief conflict with the police on April 17, 1964. The incident, later known as the Little Fruit Stand riot, would have been forgotten had it not been for the murder of Margaret Sugar, a Harlem-based Jewish Hungarian store owner, on April 29. Looking for a group of suspects upon whom to bring the charges, police officers rearrested Daniel Hamm and 5 others, one of whom was also arrested after the Little Fruit Stand riot. The Harlem Six, as the suspects became known, were beaten and pressured to sign confessions to which Hamm acceded. Ultimately, the courts tried all 6 boys and a jury found them guilty of murder. However, various civil rights lawyers intervened and urged the boys to appeal the conviction since they were denied the right to pay for their own self-defense. One of these lawyers, Truman Nelson, recorded audio testimony from all the boys and ultimately presented his tapes to the composer Steve Reich, who had recently returned to his hometown of New York City. Nelson wanted Reich to create a sound collage reminiscent of the composer's recent compositions to be played at a benefit for the retrial of the Harlem Six. Reich agreed and debuted Come Out on April 17, 1966 at New York's Town Hall. In order to compose this sound collage, Reich rifled through all the tapes Nelson gave him and ultimately found one that he liked, that of Daniel Hamm. Hamm's words, "I had to open the bruise up and let some of the bruised blood come out to show them," describes his actions in the police station where he was beaten shortly after his arrest during the Little Fruit Stand riot. Ham, fearing more assaults, needed to prove visible injury in order to be transferred to a hospital and thus opened an existing bruise. Otherwise, he feared, he would not be transferred to the hospital at all. In addition to the recording's evocative text, Reich also appreciated the recording's melodic and tonal aspects. He wanted a human voice whose vocal inflections and cadences were not only melodic, but one whose powerful messages he could preserve through tireless repetition. In order to compose Come Out, Reich took Ham's testimony, opened up the cassette, and took out the magnetic strip that encircled the tape. Then he isolated the audio section he wanted and physically cut out the rest of the testimony and the magnetic strip away with scissors. Then, using Scotch tape, he taped the magnetic strip back over itself so that it formed a continual loop. Reich did this with the phrase "come out to show them" and played it on one tape player. He did the same process with another tape and played it in a second tape player. However, technology in 1966 was not particularly advanced, so even with two of the exact same tape players, the cassettes would play at different speeds. Slowly, the cassettes would become out of sync enough that they would create an echo sound called phasing. You can hear a little bit of phasing effect after about 2 minutes in the piece. Now, if you fast forward about 7 minutes, you can really hear the cassette tapes phase. At this point, Reich duplicates the tracks from 2 cassette tapes to 4 and then to 8. This duplication creates even more phasing, even more rhythmic complexity, and at times when the cassettes are in sync, a canon for 8 voices. There are a number of ways to analyze Come Out, and I encourage those of you who are interested to read more analyses posed by several other scholars. However, I will just focus on one. I believe that the transition from the clarity of Daniel Ham's voice to the subsequent chaos that arises at the end of the piece evokes the paranoia that many Americans were feeling in the mid-1960s. One way we can better understand this evocation is by looking at Steve Reich's first major work to use tape phrasing, a 1965 composition entitled It's Gonna Rain. It's Gonna Rain uses the same compositional ideas as Come Out, but is instead created from a recording of a black Pentecostal preacher in San Francisco, preaching about a biblical narrative similar to that of Noah's Ark. Although Reich discovered his tape loop phasing process by accident, he quickly realized that the preacher's message combined well with the effect of the phasing technique. In It's Gonna Rain, the preacher's warning about the end of the world suddenly becomes an unintelligible canon, and ultimately the disintegration to white noise makes us listeners certainly feel as if the world is going to end. In Steve Reich's book, Writings on Music, he notes how the immediacy of the Cuban Missile Crisis and how his own personal divorce influenced his decision to make a tumultuous composition that reflected his own tumultuous life. It appears that 1 year later, the same rationale influenced his choice to make a tape loop of Daniel Ham. However, while the Cuban Missile Crisis and Reich's personal life exemplified the end of the world in It's Gonna Rain, Reich wrote Come Out in the aftermath of other tumultuous circumstances. Shortly after the Little Fruit Stand riot and the murder of Miss Sugar, riots broke out in Harlem. On July 16, 1964, an off-duty police lieutenant shot a 15-year-old boy. Subsequently, the incident set off 6 consecutive nights of rioting that caused the death of 1 individual after several violent clashes between Harlem residents and the police. Unfortunately, the riots in New York were the first of a series of consequential riots that shook American cities such as Watts, Los Angeles in 1965, Newark and Detroit in 1967, and several others. Such instances of black urban violence led to a paranoia that many white Americans felt. Calls to reinforce law and order by presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964 and Richard Nixon in his successful 1968 presidential campaign epitomized the fear that was sweeping the nation. Moreover, the prosecution played on black-Jewish tensions during the Harlem 6 case by implying that one of the defendants read the Quran aloud before stabbing the store owner, hence drawing upon knowledge of existing anti-Semitism within the Nation of Islam and the Black Power movement in general. For many Americans, black and white, who were frustrated with the gains made by the civil rights movement and also scared of the direction it was headed, the future in 1966, like the ending of Come Out, appeared very chaotic indeed. To conclude, I believe that by listening to Come Out and understanding both its context and the musical analysis, we listeners can understand the period in which it was written. Rice wrote "Come Out" during an important period of American history, no doubt. 1966 was a point in which civil rights politics shifted from emphasis on nonviolent protests that advocated integration to more militant stances. His composition certainly embodies the shift and provides a musical narrative that evokes the fear, dissatisfaction, and paranoia many Americans felt in the mid-1960s. In other words, with this context in mind, hopefully by now we can all listen to "Come Out" and hear a narrative of American history. I hope you all enjoyed my lecture, and thank you for turning into the Society for American Music's digital lecture programming.